My name is Dan Packer. We're here today on September 26, 2002 at the Plymouth Historical Museum in Plymouth, Michigan. As part of the Veterans History Project, we are interviewing local veterans and persons that were in support of the wars of the 20th century. Today we have a guest, Ruth Kellar. Good morning, Ruth.
Good morning.
Good morning. Okay, Ruth. You have a prepared statement I'd like to read about your experience in the Coast Guard during World War II. Is that correct?
Yes.
Okay, if you would be so kind to read that to us, please.
Thank you. The train had stopped. I raised the shade from my berth and looked out the window. The station sign said Cocoa, and looking past it, I saw palm trees for the first time. This introduction to Florida remained with me always. It was late August in 1943, and I was on a troop train which had originated in Detroit and was adding more cars of recruited young women as we made stops on our way south to the SPAR boot camp at Palm Beach. The SPARs were a relatively unknown faction of the Women's Armed Services and were an auxiliary of the Coast Guard. Since the bombing of Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, Americans had slowly and clumsily directed more and more of their attention and manpower to the Great War at hand. In 1943, the American people were exerting one of the greatest coordinated efforts in history, and as part of that effort, I had chosen to join up with the Coast Guard. I must admit that my motives were not all noble. Having lived my 20 years in a small town, I was ready to get out and see the world. Since graduation from high school in 1941, I had worked at the dime store, at Dodge Drug Store, and as a telephone operator for Michigan Bell. Now it was time to become part of the war effort, see the world, have adventures. The two-day train trip had already been an adventure. Although I had ridden the trains before to Chicago and across Michigan, sleeping in a berth and having all my meals in the dining car gave me an inkling of just how pleasurable travel by rail could be. The next stop was ours, Palm Beach. We were transferred from the train into troop trucks and delivered to the Biltmore Hotel, which would be our barracks for the 4 weeks of boot camp. Some barracks. In spite of being 6 to a room, sleeping in 3 bunk beds and all sharing one bathroom, the Biltmore could not disguise the fact that it was a luxury hotel and would rapidly regain its previous grandeur and wealthy patrons once the war was over. When I stepped out to our balcony, the impact of the sultry sea air, the stately palms, and the blue of Lake Worth took my breath away. I knew that my reaction could not have been surpassed in even the richest of the Biltmore's customary gifts. We would soon become very familiar with this gracious old building in the next 4 weeks as we manned the elevators, cleaned the corridors, and worked in the kitchen, which we learned to call the galley, as we began to learn some seagoing lingo. We had classes in Morse code, ship identification, tying knots, and Coast Guard lore, where we were reminded of the meaning of SPAR, Semper Paratus, always ready. We were issued our uniforms of navy blue serge suits with white cotton shirts and black ties we learned to do in perfect square knots. We were issued ugly black Oxfords, reminiscent of those worn by old ladies, and we were surprised at their comfort. Our work clothes were the same as those issued to our male counterparts: jeans, blue cotton work shirts, and regular white navy gob hats. We were given a song sheet so that we could learn songs to march to, such as "I've Been Working on the Railroad." We had drill practice several times a week, including a march down Worth Avenue to the ocean, where non-swimmers were taught to swim in the pool, and we swimmers could freelance in the ocean. How thrilling it was to move in cadence down the palm-lined boulevard to the hip-hop, hip-ho of our drill master. We were tested and given questionnaires to fill in so that the Coast Guard could assign certain duties with some confidence in the performance of each of us when we were sent to various stations after boot camp training. Most of us had never been away from home before, and some became very homesick, too so seriously as to be excused from service. I was too busy observing the ways of the Coast Guard and fraternizing with my roommates to be lonely, although I could empathize with a dozen or so girls who began crying one evening when As Time Goes By came over the loudspeaker. We were living in such a romantic and unpredictable time that each popular song brought memories of a certain dance, a certain night, a certain fellow. We're mostly an innocent, unsophisticated, inexperienced lot out on our own for the first time. Not exactly on our own, I must quickly add, because the Coast Guard was to be our master, our guardian, our provider, and our pride for the duration of the war. After boot camp and a week in Miami waiting for orders, I was assigned to St. Augustine for duty. This was a captain of the port base, and its function was to guard the coast from Ponte Vedra south to Flagler Beach. This was accomplished by picket boats that cruised the coast and the intercoastal waterway, and by tall wooden towers placed within sight of each other along the beach. These were manned by Coast Guardsmen in 8-hour shifts. In February of 1942, a German submarine had torpedoed a tanker off the coast of New Jersey, and America became aware of the vulnerability of its long Atlantic seaboard. Through the anxious, groping months of 1942 and 1943, the Coast Guard monitored the coastal waters while the Navy patrolled farther out at sea. There had been sightings of enemy craft and stories of saboteurs caught as they made their way ashore under cover of night. But the threat had lessened late in 1943 when the Germans and Japanese were pouring all of their resources into fronts closer to the homelands. The arrival of spars at the St. Augustine station made quite a stir, as we were the first women to invade this male bastion. There were about a dozen of us, and we were assigned rooms in the Marion Hotel, which also housed the Coast Guard offices. The hotel was an old structured building just across Bay Street from the seawall along the Matanzas River. And next door was its near twin, the Old Bay Hotel, which was the barracks for enlisted men. We were quickly assimilated into the workforce, some as cooks, some as office clerks, and some as telephone or teletype operators. With my Ma Bell experience, it was no surprise to find myself operating a small switchboard in the lobby, right in the middle of everything that was going on. The war was going well in Italy and Africa, and the Allies were making progress in the South Pacific. The Marines landed in the Marshall Islands at the end of January 1944 and were clearing out the Japanese, atoll by atoll. As the threat lessened off our coast, some personnel were transferred to ships at sea, and our captain of the port no longer required the quarters at the Marion and Bay Street hotels. 4 barracks were erected across the street where there was enough space between the seawall and Bay Street. One building contained all the administrative offices. One was used for the galley, commissary, and rec hall. One was the men's sleeping quarters, and one was the women's sleeping quarters. This arrangement made for a very compact unit, and we felt like one very large family. By July, the St. Augustine base, we all celebrated D-Day on June 6, 1944. And by July, the St. Augustine base had been restored to its pre-war level and its personnel reassigned. I was shipped to Dinner Key near Miami, where the Coast Guard had a fleet of PBYs which flew surveillance over the Keys. I operated the switchboard there. On 2 days' notice in October, I received orders to attend a brand new radio technical school for spars. We were 6 students. I learned Ohm's law and what transformers, resistors, and condensers do, and I became good at soldering. The war was going well in Italy and Africa, and the Allies were making progress in the South Pacific. The Marines landed in the Marshall Islands.
That's okay.
I graduated from the 6 months of classes at Norfolk and was proud to be wearing the insignia of Radio Technician 3rd Class. My next assignment was at the Coast Guard Research Station at Alexandria, Virginia, where I soldered connections in transmitters which had been removed from buoys because they needed repair. I wondered if any of them came in from the Aleutians, but common sense told me there must be a more convenient repair station on the West Coast. President Roosevelt died on April 12, 1945, and Truman became our president. We worried that this nondescript, uncharismatic little man was capable of leading us out of the war. Ironically, Hitler died that April too. He committed suicide in his bunker on April 30th. His death was reported to the world on May 1st, and Berlin capitulated to the Russians the next day. But the Japanese fought on. On another Coast Guard whim, I was transferred to the Loran monitoring station at Chatham, out on Cape Cod, in August. My duty there consisted of sitting before one of the 3 TV-like boxes, constantly observing the lines on the screen to be sure the Coast Guard's long-range navigation network was operating correctly. Chatham was a lovely New England seashore town, and our base was on the grounds of an old lighthouse, which was still sending out its beam to the ships at sea. The Japanese were being beaten back, but it seems they were going to hang on to the last man. Kamikaze pilots sacrificed their lives gladly as they crashed their planes in flames onto our battleships and carriers. But they had not reckoned on our colorless, bespectacled little president, who thought that more than enough of our men had been killed, and gave permission for the Air Force to drop an atomic bomb on August 6, 1945. It fell on Hiroshima and caused the greatest man-made devastation ever known. It was thought this action would save thousands of American lives and result in an immediate surrender. The Japanese shook their fists in the air and said they would fight on. Another bomb was dropped on August 9th, this time on Nagasaki. The Japanese finally surrendered. President Truman declared August 14th, 1945, VJ Day, victory in Japan. This was exactly 1 year from the date we had met. Strike that, please.
Okay.
President Truman declared August 14th, 1945, VJ Day. On September 2nd, 1945, the capitulation of the Japanese was formalized on the battleship Missouri in Tokyo Bay. So now it was just a matter of paperwork and transporting of servicemen to the discharge centers that had been set up in strategic cities throughout the country.
Thank you, Ruth. That's very interesting, very comprehensive of the whole war during that period. I got a few questions about you, Ruth, who may ask you. In the beginning, we were talked about the where you from originally. Where are you from originally?
I was born in Detroit, and I graduated from Plymouth High School. I lived in Plymouth
Your whole
life
life
up to the war.
Okay. And so I take it you graduated from Plymouth High School?
Yes.
Which is right across the street from our museum today. Now it's a junior high.
Yes.
And what year did you graduate?
1941.
41. So in June of 1941, was there much talk about war and a possible war at that point in time?
Yes, we were all totally engrossed in it, and because we all had friends in the war, we had several, well, at least a couple who had already been killed by that. And the Plymouth Mail covered all of that very well, and also people in the service would write to Plymouth Mail to tell them their news, and so it was our flag staff to show us, to keep us all
informed.
Yes.
So let me ask you this, Ruth. So back in 1941, as I've been told, there was no television back then, was there?
No, there wasn't. The first time I ever saw a screen was when I was doing Loran out on Cape Cod. I mean,
you had a dial
and I
screen.
knew the 60 cycles. I knew what that looked like on the oscilloscope.
That's interesting. So back in 1941, we had either the radio which is the major way of getting news
Yes.
in a hurry.
Yes.
And of course your newspapers. You relied a lot on your newspapers to get your information
Yes.
about what was going on in the world and opinions and things like
Yes.
that. Now, do you recall when you first heard about Pearl Harbor?
Yes.
Can you tell us about that?
Yes, I had a friend, my best girlfriend, like we have in high school, and I was going to stay overnight with her, and we were sitting up in her room talking about boys, I suppose, and her parents had a couple in, and they were playing cards downstairs, and all of a sudden we hear this, they bombed Pearl Harbor, and so we say, what is this? Of course, most of us had never heard of
Pearl Harbor.
Right. And so we came running down the stairs, and then they said, now we will be at war, now we'll be at war. And of course, that's one of those incidents that is burned in your memory. I mean, I could see all the people there and the voices.
The next day, FDR gave his famous address to Congress, and in fact, declaring war on the Empire of Japan. Do you
Yes.
recall that? You
Yes.
listened to the radio and
I'm sure I did. It's not as clear as
I hear about Pearl Harbor.
yes.
Right. And now, after the Spartan, this is an interesting organization you've joined because not a lot of us not known about it.
Yes.
You say it was an auxiliary to the Coast Guard.
yes.
Okay.
Just
So-
like the wax to the army.
Right. So who did you, what was your command structure like? Who did the SPAR's chain of command? They go to the Coast Guard, whoever was in charge of the Coast Guard, which was part of the U.S. Treasury Department. Is that correct?
Yes, it was, although I think during the war that it became part of the armed services, but I'm
Okay.
not sure about that. Yeah, it was founded in it was the oldest continuous existing
Service.
service of our government.
Of our government, that's right.
As far as military service.
Sure.
Or whatever you want to call it.
So you're quite young when you went into the service.
Uh-huh.
And did any of your immediate friends go with you, or just go by yourself?
No, I had a friend who lived in Grand Haven, and when I went there to visit, I met her sister, who was a SPAR several months before me. And then they had a wonderful, or pretty good organized Coast Guard at Grand Haven, of course,
Okay.
too, because that was like a port.
Right.
And so I just got very enthused about that branch.
And you brought with you today a newspaper article, and in fact, this article talks about, this is your maiden name, I take it. You have Ruth Edna Wellman.
Yes.
First Plymouth, first girl to join SPARS. So you've got some history there. You made a little history for the city of Plymouth, Michigan, by joining me, the first one to join. There's a picture of you here. I won't go into detail of the article, but this basically tells that you were the first one to join that organization. And then you show us this. What is this, Ruth? What is this?
This is a joke somebody had made for me.
Well, it's not true then.
Well, it might be a little. I've
We
been
thought-
known to put spells on people, and there are those dirty Japs, of course. I know that's politically incorrect.
But at that time, there was a lot of hard feeling with the Germans and the Japanese at that time.
Well, wouldn't it be? Of course.
Yeah.
I mean, here they are talking with Washington at that very time, just a week or two before, you know, and they're all smiling and all of that. And then the next thing we know, we've got those bombs dropping on our
In
big
Japan,
fleet.
and as I recall, and I just reading this from my history book, so you know, you can correct me. That was what they call a preemptive strike by the Japanese. They thought they would smash our navy
Yes.
at Pearl Harbor,
Yes.
and therefore we would sue for peace because of that. Is that correct? That was the idea behind Pearl Harbor, as far as the Japanese were concerned.
I would think so.
Yeah.
I don't think they would have thought they were going to be.
What was the attitude back home, Ruth, about the war? Now, you're in the war in 1941, December of 1941. Shortly thereafter, war is declared. Germany actually declares war on the United States. So now we have a world war. Okay. What were the attitudes of the people at the time?
Well, we had agonized for a good long time at the Germans bombing London and Britain and Churchill, I mean, of course, what wonderful strength that that country and their leader had in fighting off. I mean, France, they just rolled over them, I mean, without hardly a murmur, because they were busy being literati or whatever, they're artists or something. I didn't say that.
Well, just the attitude of that time, that was very frustrating for everybody because things were not working, and the countries are going toward war, a war footing. Britain is already engaged heavily with the Germans at that point in
Yes.
time, and they're holding them off, basically. The
Yes.
Brits are holding off the Germans, who I guess attempted to or tried to invade, but never, those plans never came through. Now, the next big date, as I recall, you mentioned in your memoir, was D-Day. Now, could you tell us what D-Day represented? What happened on D-Day? 1944, I believe? Is that
Yes,
right?
yeah. I think it's June, whatever, 6th or
June 6th, okay.
I think that it came to us pretty much as a surprise. I mean, I think it had been kept secret that this massive force had prepared this assault. And in the Coast Guard, every Friday or Monday or whatever day it was, we would have films that were taken at battle scenes, especially so that we knew what was happening
These were
with the
called
war.
newsreels. Were they called that?
I suppose.
Newsreel?
And you would think that in a big deal like crossing the channel there and hitting the beachhead, I mean, it was I don't know how many miles of it there was, but in the LSTs and the
People were waiting. The world was waiting for this because, as I recall, the Germans knew it was going to come. The Allies had been preparing, like you say, for a long time to do exactly that, to invade the European continent through France. And when did you hear about this D-Day? Was it on the radio also? You heard about it? First heard about it?
Yes, and the base, whatever base you were on, that kind of news just went through like electricity.
Yeah.
But it was amazing when we saw the films how the Coast Guard contributed so much to this action. And of course, this is their job, the coast. And here we have one post and the other coast, and 88-footers and whatever else.
So they were present. The Coast Guard, the United States Coast Guard, was present in Normandy.
Yes.
And their job was to do exactly what? Do you recall?
No, and I don't. But
No.
maybe just being alert to guarding the coast and
Right.
that sort of thing, whatever their equipment they had, and then they were used to looking out for certain things. Maybe convoy help a little, I don't know.
Right. Now, you recall during your tenure and either as a, not so much as a telephone operator, but as a radio technician, you're watching that screen on there. Did any blips come up there that you were concerned about?
Well, it was just the cycles of the transmission of which buoy was sending this and what was sending this, and then when they joined, then the ships could locate themselves.
Okay.
And so this was
a navigation aid.
Yes,
Is it navigation?
long range navigation.
So that's what you were taking care of, make sure that those signals were always there.
They had to be monitored every minute of every day.
Okay.
And before that, when I was at the radio stationed in Alexandria, I had to monitor the lighthouses or the buoys, dot or whatever signals they were sending, and they had to be monitored all up and down the coast there, probably from Norfolk on up to Maine, to be sure that they were all sending the right signals.
Make sure our ships knew where they were at and they were safe. Okay. Bruce, do you have anything to add before we close about your experience during the war period that you'd like to share with us? Or
well, the museum had kind of a little seminar talk. We had some of us old veterans from World War II and some high school students came and we sat at card tables, you know, and then we'd shift and they would ask us questions about the war. And I was amazed at how they thought we were the bad guys. Because, you know, here we are out killing people. And I thought, and I said to them, you can't imagine how patriotic and country-loving we were when we have been transgressed as we were at Pearl Harbor.
Right.
And, but they just shook their heads. They couldn't, you know,
You could not comprehend that?
No, because that wasn't what we do these days. We just turn the other cheek, I guess. I don't know.
Okay. Well, thank you very much for your prepared statement and your comments. We really appreciate it from the Veterans History Project. Thank you very much.
I'm flattered that you asked me.
No, thank you. All right.